Hello and welcome back to Too Sweet MTG and welcome to another Commander deck tech. In today's video, we're going to be looking at Krenko Mob Boss.
It is 2 red for a 3/3 legendary creature Goblin Warrior. It has tap, create X 1/1 red goblin creature tokens where X is the number of goblins that you control. Krenko is not just one of the best Goblin Matters commanders out there, but he's also just one of the most powerful commanders of all time. Played fairly, he makes you an obscene board state of goblins incredibly quickly. But we're not really here to play fair. We're going to be juicing Krenko to the gills with all manner of awesome goblin-based synergies. Our game plan will be pretty simple. Firstly, we're going to want to play as many goblins as possible. The more goblins we have in play, the more Krenko we'll make. We'll then be playing a bunch of powerful lords to make our goblin horde a super scary threat. On top of our lords, we'll also be playing a bunch of ways of giving our creatures haste. Not only will this mean our creatures can attack the turn they come down, but will also mean that we can activate Krenko straight away as soon as we cast it, and then attack with the tokens that we've just made. As well as the haste enablers, we'll also be running ways of untapping Krenko, so we can use this ability to go really wide, really quickly, multiple times in a turn. To finish off our opponents, we can either attack them with our buffed up Goblin Horde, or kill them with indirect damage from effects that ping players when creatures come into play under our control. We'll even have some infinite combos as ways of winning the game as well, but you'll have to wait to the end of the video before we go over those. Before we jump in, just a reminder of how these videos will work. We'll be giving you all the categories and numbers of cards that you need in each of them to run. You can then pick the cards that suit your budget or your playstyle from the options that we give, so you really can make this deck your own. Everything we mentioned will be down in the description below. While you're there, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving the video a like, it really helps out a lot. Our first section is our Goblin Matters section. These are the cards that'll either help us make a goblin horde or buff up that horde to lethal levels. First up, we have a bunch of goblins in a can. These are themselves goblins that come down with a bunch of friends so we can make that board state ready for our commander to double. We have cards like Goblin Instigator, Mogg War Marshal, Beetleback Chief, and then the almighty Siege Gang Commander. We next have some Rabblemaster style cards. These come down and make us more goblins whenever they attack. What's great about these is that if they are left unchecked, they can snowball really quickly. Next up, we have some spells that make us goblin tokens. We have cards like Dragon Fodder, Krenko's Command, Hordeling Outburst, Empty the Warrens, and Goblin War Party. I will be honest, I do like these less than the creatures that make you goblins, as creatures will generally work better, as they themselves will count towards Krenko, but these are still fantastic budget options that are still capable of putting a ton of rowdy lads onto the board. Next, we have some Lord effects. These are creatures that buff up our goblins and help them out in other ways as well. For me, the best two out there are Goblin Chieftain, which gives all of our goblins that important haste, and also +1/+1. Then you have Goblin Warchief, that also gives them haste, but then makes all of our goblins one generic mana less to cast, meaning we can dump out our hand really quickly. Next we have some other fantastic lords. Cards like Rundvelt Hordemaster, Hobgoblin Bandit Lord, Goblin King, and Goblin Trashmaster all give our creatures +1/+1, and then also give them a bunch of other cool abilities as well, such as giving us some card advantage, removal, and even Mountain Walk. Lastly in this section we have Goblin Lackey and Warren Instigator. This is a really fun, albeit slightly pricey option. They come down really early, deal some damage to an opponent, and then let us cheat one of our big goblins from our hand straight into play. It's really not necessary, but it is very cool. Next up is our card draw section. Like with most decks, we'll want at least 8 bits here to keep the deck ticking over. Unlike most decks, however, a lot of the cards in this section will revolve around goblins. First up is Conspicuous Snoop. In this deck, this is basically a 2-mana future sight, which honestly is pretty insane. This will let you play so many goblins from the top of the library, it'll be fantastic. But the fact this also gets the activated abilities of goblins on top, as once the Snoop is in play and has untapped, those abilities on top will basically all have haste. Next we have Goblin Ringleader and Muxus Goblin Grandee. These both come into play and let us dig into our deck looking for goblins. The Ringleader puts them into our hand, but Muxus can put a bunch of them straight onto the battlefield. We then have Goblin Recruiter. This is a stupid card that when it comes into play, lets us stack the top of our deck with any number of goblins. This is honestly fantastic with cards like Conspicuous Snoop, and is a great way of getting our combo pieces lined up, so do keep this card in mind when we get to our win con section. Another great tutor is Goblin Matron. This gives us the best goblin from our deck and puts it straight into our hand, an absolute steal for just 3 mana. Then for some more card advantage, we have Moria Marauder. This gives all of our goblins the ability that when they deal combat damage, we exile the top card of our library and get to play them until end of turn. That is every goblin that we control. With one swing of a decent board state, this could give us access to so many cards, it'll be unbelievable. Another bit of card advantage from our deck is Descendant's Fury. This lets us sacrifice a creature that dealt combat damage to an opponent and then reveal cards from our deck until we hit a creature of the same type. This is perfect for cashing in a goblin token to turn it into something bigger. Another cool option here is Grenzo Havoc Razor. This gives us card advantage, but from our opponent's decks. Really great if you want to chaos up a game a little bit. You can then top up your card draw section with some red looting or rummaging effects, with things like Faithless Looting and Thrill of Possibility. These are just really solid at keeping things ticking over. Then lastly, we have some artifacts that help draw us some cards. Skullclamp will be great at cashing in those 1/1 goblins for some lovely card draw. And then because of how many tokens we'll be making, Idol of Oblivion is basically a better Phyrexian Arena in this deck. Then finally, Vanquisher's Banner is a great mid-game effect that pumps up our whole team, while also drawing us cards whenever we then cast a goblin. Moving on next to our ramp section, and like with most decks we need at least 8 to 10 bits to give the deck the fuel it needs. As we're not in green, we're starting off with a base of mana rocks. Outside of Soul Ring, we generally want them to tap for red, so things like Arcane Signet, Fire Diamond, and hopefully Felwar Stone are perfect here. We want red mana because of the number of low drops with red pips that we're going to want to be casting. Next we have some 3 mana rocks. Heraldic Banner gets in because it's also an anthem effect for all of our goblins. Then you have Patriarch's Seal, which also makes some mana, but importantly also lets us untap our commander so we can activate it twice a turn to quadruple the amount of goblins that we control. You then have Nyx's Lotus that taps to add mana equal to the devotion we have to a colour. As we've mentioned, we'll have a lot of red pips on our little gobbos running around on the board, and this will make us an absolute ton of mana for us. We can also help reduce the cost of our spells with a card like Ruby Medallion. This makes all of our red spells cost 1 generic less to cast. You then have some one-time bits of ramp, with cards that make mana equal to the number of goblins that we control. Brightstone Ritual and Battle Hymn are great at giving us that one-time bit of mana boost for a turn. Next up is our interaction section. We'll start with 8 bits and then go up from there the more competitive that our playgroup is. First up we have Goblin Crater Maker and Gem Palm Incinerator. The Crater Maker can deal 2 damage to any creature, or importantly can also take out any colourless creature no matter what its size. The Incinerator we can suckle from our hand for 1 and a red to deal a damage to any creature onto the battlefield equal to the number of goblins that we have in play, while also drawing a card. We then also have Volley Veteran. Let's call this the Flametongue Carbu of goblins that can take out a key creature of our opponents. Next we have a bunch of effects that either sacrifice goblins or trigger when we sacrifice goblins to deal damage to any target. This could be our opponent's creatures or could even be our opponent's life totals. Remember these cards when we get to our WinCon section and we're talking about making infinite goblins. But back to sacking goblins, we also have Goblin Grenade. This is the most goblin card of all time. Power level wise, you probably can do better, but flavor wise, I love it. I think it's fantastic. We then have some more instant speed bits of interaction to top things up. We have Outnumber, that if we have any kind of board state, will take out anything that we want. You then have Abrade and Cathartic Pyre, which are basically lightning strikes with some added utility upside, and then Chaos Warp just deals with anything that we need to deal with. For some board wipes, we have some classic options with an overloaded Mizium Mortars and the always playable in any red deck Blasphemous Act. Next up is a little bit of protection. Krenko will paint a target on its back very quickly because it is known as a very scary commander. First up we have the classics with Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots. The protection these give will be invaluable, but the fact they also can give Krenko haste so we can activate it straight away will be fantastic. Next we have Goblin Chirurgeon, a great free sacrifice outlet that also lets us cash in a goblin to regenerate Krenko or any other key goblin. Okay, so we have the base of our deck. Let's go over some dedicated ways of winning the game. First up, we have Impact Tremors, Witty Roastmaster, and Perforos, God of the Forge. These all deal damage to each opponent whenever a creature comes into play under our control. With all the tokens that we'll be making, these will honestly deal so much damage to our opponents over the course of a game, it'll be super scary. We then have Goblin Warstrike, Mob Justice, and Massive Raid. These can all deal damage to an opponent equal to the number of goblins that we control. One of these spells could honestly finish off an opponent without us even having to attack them, which will just be fantastic as it means we can then Alpha Strike our other opponents out of the game. When it does come time to attack, we have a bunch of ways of boosting up our gobbos to make them all the more lethal. Ardos, Cobbler of War, and Ogre Battle Driver buff up our freshly made goblins with +2 power and give them haste so they can swing in straight away. We then have Goblin Lookout, which has a sacrifice a goblin to give all goblins in play +2/+0. And then we have a bunch more ways of buffing up our attacking goblins all up and down the curve. We have Goblin War Driver, we have Shed Animosity and the phenomenal Coat of Arms, which really gets things stupid, and then we have the always solid Eldrazi Monument. Okay, it's combo time, and I will be honest, there are actually way too many to go over in great detail, so I will put a link down to MTG decks which goes over each one in slightly more detail. The majority of the combos fall into two different categories. The first bunch come down to Krenko being in play, plus a sacrifice outlet that makes mana, and then a way to repeatedly untap it. So, if you have Krenko, plus cards like Thornbite Staff, Staff of Domination, or Sword of the Perunes that untap Krenko either when a creature dies, or if you pay enough mana to untap it, we want to then combine that with cards like Skirt Prospector, Phyrexian Altar, and Thermopod, that make mana when you sack creatures to them. What all this results in is that with Krenko and a couple of goblins in play, you'll be making enough goblins with Krenko that you can sack them to generate more than enough mana to untap Krenko over and over again. This means that you're then making infinite tokens. You can either swing with them, or if you have something like an Impact Tremors in play, you'll just win the game then. The number of goblins that you need in play does change depending on how much things cost to activate, but it is honestly all very attainable very quickly. The second way the combos tend to look is by adding haste enablers instead of untappers. So things like Mass Hysteria, Goblin Chieftain, and Goblin Warchief that give all of our goblins haste. How these work with Krenko is that you need one of each of these pieces on the battlefield, and to control goblins equal to or greater than the cost of Krenko and its command attacks. So that basically means if you've only cast Krenko once, you need at least 6 goblins in play. If you cast it twice, you need at least 8 goblins in play. The reason for this is that we can tap Krenko to make a bunch more goblins. We can then sack Krenko and enough goblins to generate mana. We can then recast Krenko with that mana that we've made to then tap it straight away as it has haste. When we tap it, we make more goblins, which we can then sack, and then repeat this infinitely, because we'll always be making more goblins than the amount the command attacks will cost. There are so many more combos using some of the other cards that we've mentioned. You can also add a card like Mana Echoes as a mana producer to pay for untapping stuff. Again, check out the link in the description. Rounding off the deck with some utility lands, as we're a monocolored deck, we really can run a bunch of cool cards here. First, we have some lands that care about goblins. Firstly, Den of the Bugbear makes us more goblin tokens that we absolutely love, and then we have Goblin Burrows that can make one bigger to get in for some more damage. For some red producing lands, we have Castle Embereth, which can help buff up our team. You then have Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, which we can run because we're a mono red deck running a bunch of mountains, and it is just more damage at the end of the day. You then have Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, which I did not realise was so expensive at time of recording, but if you have one, it will help us make a bucket load of extra mana. For some colourless lands, we have Command Beacon, great at any deck that revolves around the commander, and then you have War Room for some additional lovely card draw.
Right, thank you all very much for watching. Please make sure you like, share, subscribe, especially if you found this video helpful. We're currently racing towards 100,000 subscribers. There's only about 96 or so thousand, something like that, to go. But if you could subscribe, it would really help me out. But anyway, until next time, I will see you all soon. Goodbye.